The sound of the funeral bells still echoed in Emily's mind long after the ceremony had ended. Her mother, the only family she had ever known, was gone. The grief was an ever-present companion, following her like a shadow as she stood beside the gravestone, her fingers trembling as they clasped the black lace handkerchief in her hand. The tears had been shed already. Now, there was nothing left but the hollow ache of loss and the overwhelming silence that surrounded her. Emily had never imagined that this would happen. She had always thought that her mother, despite all the struggles, would somehow be there forever. But life, as it often does, had cruelly taken her away, leaving Emily in a world that felt colder and emptier. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cemetery as Emily's mind spun, thinking about what came next. The funeral had been a blur, a formal procession of sorrow that didn't feel real. Now, standing alone, her thoughts turned to the inevitable question she had been avoiding. What would happen to her now? Her mother had always been her rock. It was her mother who taught her how to ride a bike, who held her hand during every scraped knee, and who whispered words of comfort when the world seemed too big. Now, Emily was left with nothing but an empty space where her mother had once been. The answer came before she was ready. Her aunt, Margaret Hale, had arrived at the funeral shortly after it was over. She was a tall, composed woman, always impeccably dressed in expensive, neatly pressed clothes. Emily had heard stories about her from her mother, stories of a woman who had always been distant, who followed rules with an almost obsessive precision. Maggie, as her mother had called her, was a woman of principles. In Emily's eyes, she had always seemed to embody everything her mother had not: cold, structured, and unyielding. Emily had never been close to Aunt Maggie. They had seen each other at family gatherings, but those were distant, polite exchanges where no real connection was ever made. The truth was, Emily had always felt like an outsider when she was around her aunt. Maggie's world seemed so different from her own, a world where emotions were controlled, where affection was rare, and where everything had a place. It was a world that Emily could never quite fit into. "I'll take care of you now," Aunt Maggie had said, her voice firm yet devoid of any warmth. "You'll come live with me. I've already made arrangements." There was no question, no negotiation. Emily's life was about to change in ways she didn't fully understand yet. But what choice did she have? Her mother was gone, and Aunt Maggie was her only family left. In that moment, the reality of it hit Emily like a tidal wave. She was going to live with a woman who was a stranger to her, someone who might provide for her but whose care would come at a great emotional cost. The ride to Aunt Maggie's house was long and silent. The car's leather seats creaked under the weight of unspoken words, and the air between them was thick with a tension Emily couldn't shake. She stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur. Everything felt like it was moving too fast, like she was trapped in a dream she couldn't wake up from. Aunt Maggie didn't speak much during the drive, her eyes focused on the road ahead. She was calm, as always, but Emily could sense the underlying stiffness in her movements. It was as if Maggie was holding something back, something she couldn't or wouldn't say. Emily's heart thudded in her chest. She wondered what life would be like in this new house, under the watchful eye of a woman who had never shown much interest in her before. Would Aunt Maggie expect her to act differently now? Would she treat her like a daughter? Or would Emily always be nothing more than a burden in her eyes? The house loomed ahead, its tall, imposing structure a stark contrast to the warm, modest home Emily had shared with her mother. The large windows and pristine white walls gave it a cold, impersonal feel, like a fortress rather than a home. "This is it," Aunt Maggie said, finally breaking the silence as she parked the car in front of the house. "You'll stay in the guest room for now. It's all ready for you." Emily glanced at her aunt, her stomach tightening. She wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm that now separated them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, feeling the weight of her loss settle deeper into her chest. The inside of the house was just as cold and sterile as the outside. The walls were lined with expensive paintings and polished furniture, each piece carefully chosen to convey a sense of order and status. There was no clutter here, no sign of life or warmth. Everything had its place. And Emily knew instinctively that it would stay that way. This was not a home, it was a showpiece. Aunt Maggie led Emily up the stairs to the guest room, her steps measured and precise. "You'll be comfortable here," she said, gesturing to the neatly made bed and the empty shelves that lined the walls. "I'll expect you to keep everything in order. I've arranged for a tutor to help you with your studies and a housekeeper who will come by once a week. You'll continue your education here and prepare for college." Emily's heart sank. This wasn't what she had imagined. She had thought she would find comfort here, but instead, she felt like a guest in a foreign land. The reality of her new life had hit her hard. She wasn't just mourning her mother's death, she was mourning the loss of her sense of self, her place in the world. That night, as Emily lay in the unfamiliar bed, she couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for her to feel at home in this strange new life. How long before Aunt Maggie would look at her and see more than just a responsibility? Emily wanted so badly to feel wanted, to feel like she belonged somewhere again. But deep down, she feared that this would be her new reality. A life spent in the shadows of a woman who saw her as nothing more than an obligation. The loneliness was overwhelming. It clung to Emily like a second skin, suffocating her in the silence of the empty room. She missed her mother more than she could put into words, and the thought of never hearing her voice again made her chest tighten with an aching emptiness. As the night stretched on, Emily closed her eyes, hoping that sleep would bring her some relief from the whirlwind of emotions she was experiencing. But even as she drifted off, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had changed forever, that she was no longer the girl she had once been. And in the morning, when she awoke to the cold, sterile walls of Aunt Maggie's house, she would have to face the reality of it all over again. She was no longer just a daughter, she was a burden. And somehow, she had to learn how to carry that weight. The morning came too quickly for Emily, the soft light of dawn streaming through the curtains of her new guest room. She woke up with a start, her heart racing as she took in her surroundings. For a moment, it felt like she was still trapped in a nightmare, disoriented and unsure if this was really happening. But as her eyes adjusted to the sterile whiteness of the room, the memories of yesterday flooded back. Her mother's absence, the coldness of Aunt Maggie, the empty promise of a new life, it was all too real. She sat up in bed, her feet touching the polished wooden floor, and wrapped her arms around herself as if to ward off the chill. She didn't know what to do next. The house was quiet, eerily so. There were no sounds of people bustling around, no warm conversations over breakfast. Just the silence that had come to define her new existence. Emily stood slowly, walking over to the window. She looked out at the yard, at the perfectly manicured lawn, and the towering trees that seemed to cast long shadows over everything. It was as if nature itself was trying to retreat, making the house feel even more isolated. The world outside was so alive, so full of possibilities, yet she felt trapped here, in this lonely house with no one to turn to. Aunt Maggie hadn't said anything about breakfast. It was clear that Emily was expected to figure it out on her own. The woman didn't seem to care if Emily ate or not, as long as she didn't disrupt the order of things. Emily wasn't sure what to expect in the kitchen, but as she ventured downstairs, the house seemed even colder, the walls closing in around her. She found the kitchen immaculate, as if it had never been used. Stainless steel appliances gleamed under the overhead lights, and the countertops were spotless, with not a single crumb or dish in sight. There was a note left on the kitchen island, next to a perfectly folded napkin. "There are eggs in the fridge. Help yourself." That was it. No offer of companionship, no warmth in the gesture. Just a cold command masked as a polite note. Emily wasn't hungry, but she didn't want to sit in her room and stare at the walls. So, she opened the fridge, found the eggs, and made herself a quick breakfast. As she sat down at the breakfast bar, she couldn't help but think of the countless mornings she had spent with her mother, eating pancakes and talking about her day. Those mornings had been full of laughter, the warmth of her mother's voice filling the room. Now, There was nothing but silence and the clinking of a fork against an empty plate. The days that followed were a blur of routine. Emily had a tutor who came by once a week, but the lessons felt like a formality. Aunt Maggie had insisted that Emily keep up with her education, even though it seemed like the least of Emily's concerns. There were no real conversations, no emotional connection between them. Maggie was always busy, buried in her work as a corporate lawyer, her phone constantly ringing with calls and messages. Emily was left to entertain herself, feeling more and more like a burden with each passing day. At night, the house was still. Emily would sit in her room, reading or staring at the walls, trying to make sense of everything. She often wondered if her aunt even noticed her presence. It wasn't that Maggie was unkind, at least not overtly, but there was a starkness to everything she did. Emily had never been a part of her aunt's world, and it was clear that Maggie didn't know how to make her feel welcome in hers. Every interaction felt calculated, every word weighed, as if Maggie had decided long ago that showing any emotion was a weakness. Emily's feelings of isolation grew with each day. She missed her mother so much it hurt. The house was too quiet, too empty, and the coldness of her aunt's indifference only seemed to magnify the loneliness. It felt as though her life had been erased, and she had been placed in this sterile world where nothing had meaning. On the evening of her first week in Aunt Maggie's house, Emily wandered into the living room, aimlessly flicking through the channels on the TV. She didn't really want to watch anything. She just wanted to feel like she wasn't alone. But Maggie was sitting at her desk, working as usual, her face illuminated by the glow of her computer screen. Emily had never understood her aunt's need to be so focused on work. It was as if her entire existence revolved around her job, as if that was all that mattered. There was no room for anything else, no room for Emily, no room for emotion. Emily had never asked for much. She simply wanted to feel like she belonged, like she was wanted. But with Aunt Maggie, that didn't seem possible. She wanted to ask her aunt about her past, to learn more about the woman who had become her guardian, but the words never came. Every time she tried to speak to Maggie, the woman's cold demeanor shut her down, leaving Emily to retreat back into the silence of her room. It wasn't that Maggie didn't care, it was that she didn't know how to show it. Emily had seen glimpses of it, the small gestures, the unspoken actions, but they were fleeting, hard to grasp. A plate of food left outside her door when Emily was too tired to go down for dinner. The occasional nod of approval when Emily finished a task. But these were all silent forms of care, the kind of care that Emily couldn't fully understand, and the kind she wasn't sure how to accept. One evening, Emily sat at her desk, staring at the homework she had been assigned. She couldn't concentrate. Her mind kept drifting back to the feeling of being unwanted, to the sense that she was living in someone else's life, trapped in a world she didn't belong to. She missed the simple comfort of her mother's voice, the way her mother's presence had made the world feel like a safer place. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. She quickly wiped the stray tear from her cheek before calling out, "Come in." It was Maggie, standing in the doorway. She looked at Emily with a mix of curiosity and distance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Emily couldn't remember the last time they had had a real conversation, one where Maggie actually looked at her, one where Maggie wasn't preoccupied with something else. "I've arranged for a few activities for you tomorrow," Maggie said, her voice neutral. "You'll meet some people your age. You'll have opportunities to make connections here." Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. She wasn't sure she wanted to make connections in this house, where she felt more like a guest than a member of the family. But she didn't say anything. There didn't seem to be a point. Maggie lingered for a moment before turning to leave. Just before she closed the door, she paused and glanced back at Emily, her face unreadable. "I don't know how to be a mother," she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. "But I do care for you, Emily. In my own way." And with that, she left the room. Emily sat there in silence, her mind racing. It was the closest Maggie had ever come to expressing something close to affection. But the words were so few, so simple, that Emily didn't know how to respond. It felt like a promise, but one that was wrapped in uncertainty. As Emily lay back on her bed that night, she thought about Maggie's words. She didn't know how to be a mother, but she cared. That was the closest thing to love Emily had ever heard from her aunt. And though it didn't feel like the warm, unconditional love she had known with her mother, it was a start, a flicker of hope in a world that had felt dark and cold for far too long. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to Aunt Maggie than Emily had realized. Maybe, despite the coldness, there was a way for her to find her place in this house, in this life. But for now, all Emily could do was hold on to that fragile spark of hope, uncertain of where it would lead her, but willing to follow it nonetheless. The days following Aunt Maggie's rare, half-hearted admission seemed to stretch endlessly. Emily tried to settle into the routine her aunt had set for her. Every morning, she woke up early, made herself breakfast, and then busied herself with schoolwork and household chores. Aunt Maggie, as usual, retreated into her world of work, barely acknowledging Emily's presence unless it was necessary. But for some reason, the silence between them had become a little less suffocating after the brief exchange of words the other night. Emily couldn't explain it, but there was something different now, a crack in the fortress that Maggie had carefully built around herself. One afternoon, as Emily sat on the back porch reading a book, she noticed Aunt Maggie standing by the garden, staring at the neatly tended flower beds. The woman had always been preoccupied with appearances, and her garden was no different, carefully manicured. Every flower in its place, no room for wildness or chaos. The flowers themselves were beautiful, yes, but the garden lacked the warmth of a personal touch, the kind that might make it feel like a home rather than a showpiece. Emily watched Maggie for a moment, sensing the unusual stillness in the air. There was something almost melancholic about her aunt as she bent to adjust one of the plants, her fingers brushing gently against the petals. Maggie's face remained stoic, but her eyes seemed far away, lost in a memory or a thought that Emily could not reach. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a spark of curiosity. She had spent so much time resenting Maggie's cold demeanor that she hadn't stopped to think about why her aunt had turned out this way. Was it always like this for her? Or was there a time when Maggie had been different, when she had allowed herself to feel the warmth of a family, of a home? Emily hesitated for a moment, torn between the desire to ask Maggie about her past and the fear that it would lead to more rejection. But there was something in her aunt's expression that made her want to try. She stood up slowly, her book forgotten, and walked across the yard, her footsteps muffled on the soft grass. "Maggie," she called softly, unsure if she should address her aunt so informally. But the name slipped out naturally. Maggie turned slightly, her face unreadable as she met Emily's gaze. "Yes, I was wondering," Emily began, her voice faltering. "Why do you care for the garden so much? It's beautiful, but it's so perfect. Doesn't it get tiring?" Maggie looked down at the flower bed, as if contemplating the question. For a long moment, there was silence, and Emily thought her aunt wouldn't answer. But then, with a sigh, Maggie straightened up and wiped her hands on her pants before speaking. "When you grow up in a house where nothing is ever in order, you learn to crave control," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Things were always chaotic when I was young. My family was a mess. So I started taking control of the small things I could manage, like the garden. It was my way of creating something perfect, something I could count on, something that would never disappoint me." Emily was silent, taking in her aunt's words. She hadn't expected such an honest answer, and the vulnerability in Maggie's voice surprised her. It wasn't the stone-cold woman Emily had grown up around, but someone who had been hurt, someone who had learned to protect herself by shutting the world out. "It sounds lonely," Emily said softly, stepping a little closer to her aunt, her gaze fixed on the flowers. "Living like that?" Maggie looked at her, a faint glimmer of something. Was it regret passing through her eyes? It was. But it was safer. "I thought if I kept everything under control, I wouldn't be hurt again. I thought if I didn't let anyone in, I wouldn't have to face the pain that came with loving them." Emily nodded slowly, feeling a strange mix of sadness and empathy. She had never thought of her aunt as a person who had been hurt. In her mind, Maggie was always the strong, distant figure, the one who could do everything on her own, the one who didn't need anyone. But now, in the quiet of the garden, Emily saw her in a different light. Maggie was just as human as anyone else, shaped by her own experiences and wounds. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice small, "for not understanding." Maggie didn't answer at first, and for a moment, Emily thought the conversation had ended. But then, to her surprise, Maggie stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare, almost hesitant gesture. "I'm sorry too," Maggie murmured, "for not being the aunt you needed. I didn't know how to be. But I'm trying, Emily. I really am." Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she looked up at her aunt. It was the first time Maggie had ever acknowledged her own shortcomings, the first time she had admitted that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't perfect. The weight that had settled on Emily's chest for so long seemed to lift, just a little. There was still a long way to go, and they were still strangers in many ways, but for the first time, Emily felt like she wasn't alone in this house. For the first time, Maggie wasn't just a distant authority figure. She was someone who was willing to make an effort, to change, even if it was hard. "I don't need you to be perfect," Emily said softly. "I just need you to be here. I just need to know that you care." Maggie's lips trembled into a faint smile, and she nodded. The gesture small but meaningful. "I do care," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than you know." Emily felt a warm rush of relief flood through her chest, as though a dam had broken, releasing all the feelings she had kept bottled up for so long. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was a start. As the days passed, things slowly began to change. The distance between Emily and her aunt didn't disappear overnight, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when they connected, when the silence wasn't so heavy, when Maggie's walls weren't so impenetrable. They didn't talk much, but the simple act of sitting together in the garden, Emily reading while Maggie tended to the flowers, felt like a step forward. There was an unspoken understanding now that hadn't existed before. And though Emily knew that their relationship would take time to heal, she no longer felt like an outsider in her own home. She could feel Maggie's care, hidden beneath the layers of reserve, and in turn, Emily allowed herself to care too. It wasn't much yet, but it was enough. For the first time since her mother's death, Emily began to believe that there was hope for her and Aunt Maggie. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something real together. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be theirs. And that was enough for now. As the weeks passed, Emily slowly adjusted to the rhythm of life at Aunt Maggie's house. The silence, once oppressive, had become more manageable. Less of a wall between them and more of a quiet space they both inhabited. They didn't talk much, but the small gestures, Maggie offering to make Emily tea when she was working late, Emily setting the table for dinner without being asked, began to form the faint outlines of a new routine, one that felt less like obligation and more like shared understanding. Emily had learned to fill her time with books, studying for college, and helping around the house, but the real comfort came in the unspoken companionship that bloomed between them. Maggie would often retreat to her study in the evenings, working until late, but there were moments, brief, fleeting ones, when she would step out of her office and simply be present. Once, Maggie offered to teach Emily how to garden, something her aunt had always found solace in. They spent an afternoon planting flowers in the backyard, working side by side in the cool breeze. It wasn't an earth-shattering change, but it was something. Emily realized that this was Maggie's way of trying, of reaching out without words. One evening, after dinner, Emily found herself sitting alone in the living room, flipping through a photo album her mother had kept. It was the only part of her mother that hadn't been packed away or sold. The old, worn album contained pictures from Emily's childhood, pictures of her mother smiling, of family holidays that now felt like distant memories. As she turned the pages, her heart tightened in her chest. It was as though she could feel the absence of her mother in every photograph, the faces frozen in time, reminding her of everything she had lost. Maggie entered the room quietly, her steps soft on the carpet. She had been working late as usual, but something about her demeanor seemed different tonight. She walked over to Emily and paused, glancing at the album in her hands. "I know it's hard," Maggie said, her voice surprisingly gentle. Emily looked up at her, surprised by the sincerity in her aunt's words. For a moment, she felt a lump rise in her throat. And she quickly wiped her eyes, not wanting Maggie to see her vulnerability. "It's just," Emily began, her voice trembling, "I miss her so much. I don't know how to move forward." Maggie stood still for a moment, her gaze softening as she took in Emily's words. She hesitated before sitting down beside her on the couch, something she had rarely done before. For a moment, they just sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't cold or suffocating, it felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of shared grief. "I know," Maggie said quietly. "I didn't know your mother the way you did. But I know what it feels like to lose someone you love. I lost my parents when I was younger. It changes you in ways you can't even imagine. And you don't always know how to cope." Emily looked at her aunt, surprised by the rawness in her voice. Maggie had always been so guarded, so wrapped up in her own stoic world. To hear her speak of her own loss was something Emily had never expected. "I never wanted to be like them," Maggie continued, her gaze fixed on the photo album. "I didn't want to be the kind of person who builds walls around themselves. But sometimes the pain is so much. It's easier to hide behind the walls than to face it." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of her aunt's words settle in her chest. She had spent so much time resenting Maggie for not being the mother figure she had needed, for being emotionally distant. But now, sitting next to her, she realized that Maggie's coldness wasn't because she didn't care, it was because she didn't know how to show it. She had been hurt, just like Emily, and had learned to protect herself in the only way she knew how. I think we're both just learning how to cope with the hurt," Emily said softly. "And maybe we can help each other." Maggie turned her head to look at Emily, her eyes softening. "I'd like that," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The next few weeks brought small, but significant changes. Emily began to feel more at home in the house, though it was still a work in progress. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when the past seemed to weigh heavily on them. But there were also moments of genuine connection. Emily no longer felt like a burden, nor did she feel like a stranger. She had found a place here, in this house, and more importantly, in her aunt's life. Maggie, too, had begun to show more of her true self. She started to open up in small ways, sharing stories of her childhood, laughing at Emily's awkward attempts at cooking dinner, even offering advice when Emily had trouble with her schoolwork. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Emily to see the cracks in her aunt's walls. One night, after dinner, Emily found Maggie sitting alone in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. It was rare for Maggie to sit down and relax, and the sight made Emily pause. She hesitated, unsure if this was a moment to join her aunt or retreat to her own room. But something in her made her approach. "Mind if I join you?" Emily asked, her voice tentative. Maggie looked up, her eyes soft. "Of course not. Sit down." Emily settled into the armchair opposite Maggie, the comfortable silence stretching between them. For a while, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the quiet of the evening. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. "You know, I think we're doing better than I expected," she said, her voice thoughtful. Emily smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "Yeah, I think so too." Maggie looked at her niece, her expression softened. "I never knew how to be a mother, Emily. But I'm trying. And I think you're learning to be more than just a burden." Emily's heart swelled at the words. For so long, she had felt like a weight, an inconvenience in her aunt's life. But now, Maggie's words felt like a lifeline, a sign that they were both beginning to heal together. "I'm learning, too," Emily said softly. "I'm learning that love doesn't always look the way we think it should." Maggie nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe it's not about perfection. Maybe it's about doing the best we can." And in that moment, Emily realized that she no longer felt like a burden. She had found a place for herself here, not just in Maggie's house, but in her heart. It wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't be perfect, but for the first time since her mother's death, Emily felt a sense of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. And that was enough. As the months passed, the changes in the relationship between Emily and Aunt Maggie became even more evident. The house, once cold and sterile, began to feel like a home. The walls, once filled with nothing but silence, now held the echoes of laughter, conversations, and quiet moments of understanding. Neither of them expected everything to fall into place immediately, but the growing comfort between them felt like the beginning of something meaningful, something that, despite all the scars of the past, might just work. Emily's days began to settle into a comfortable rhythm. She focused on her studies, preparing for the college applications she had put off for so long, and began volunteering at a local shelter, feeling a pull to help others who were in need of care and support. Aunt Maggie, on the other hand, had started to let go of some of her rigid routines. Her work as a corporate lawyer remained demanding, but she began taking small breaks to enjoy the simpler things in life, like a walk through the neighborhood or sitting down for a quiet dinner without checking her phone every few minutes. These little changes in her behavior didn't go unnoticed by Emily. It was as though Maggie had realized that there was more to life than work and control, and that maybe, just maybe, the connection they had was worth nurturing. One Saturday afternoon, Emily and Maggie found themselves in the living room together, a rare occurrence since they had both been busy with their respective lives. Emily was reading a book when Maggie came into the room holding a small box in her hands. "I found this in the attic," Maggie said, holding up the box with a hint of curiosity in her voice. "I thought you might like to take a look." Emily set down her book, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Maggie sat down beside her and opened the box, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and trinkets that seemed to have been stored away for years. Emily looked at the items with a mix of fascination and nostalgia. There were pictures of a young Maggie with her parents, a few faded snapshots of family holidays, and even a letter written in Maggie's mother's handwriting. "These were my parents' things," Maggie explained, her voice quiet. "They kept everything. Every little moment that mattered. I didn't look at them much after they passed away. I guess I was too afraid of what I'd find, too afraid of what it would remind me of." Emily glanced at Maggie, sensing the depth of emotion behind her aunt's words. "Do you want to talk about them?" she asked gently, her voice laced with understanding. Maggie hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't know where to start. My parents, they weren't perfect. They were distant, and there was always tension in our home. They tried to love me, I know they did. But it wasn't the kind of love that made me feel safe. It was the kind of love that left me wondering what was wrong with me for not being enough." Emily reached over, her hand resting on top of Maggie's, a silent gesture of comfort. It was clear now that Maggie's coldness wasn't just a result of her own personality, it was a defense mechanism, a shield built from years of disappointment and emotional neglect. It was no wonder she had been so closed off. "Sometimes I think that's why I've been so distant with you," Maggie continued, her voice softer now. "I didn't know how to give you what you needed. I didn't know how to be a mother when I never really had one myself." Emily felt a pang of empathy. "You've done your best, Maggie," she said quietly. "And you're doing better now." Maggie smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Maybe, but I think I could have done better sooner. I could have been more present. I could have." "You can still try," Emily interrupted, her voice steady. "It's never too late to try." For the first time in a long while, Maggie seemed to allow herself to soften, to acknowledge the vulnerability that had been buried beneath her tough exterior. She nodded slowly, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "You're right. It's not too late. I think I'm learning how to do this. To care in a way that doesn't feel like a duty, but like something I actually want to do." They sat in silence for a while, looking through the old photographs together. Maggie began to share stories of her parents, stories of their struggles, their flaws, and the small moments of joy they had shared. It wasn't the perfect family narrative Emily had once imagined, but it was real, and it was something Maggie had never allowed herself to say out loud before. As the afternoon faded into evening, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't need her aunt to be perfect. She didn't need a flawless relationship. What mattered was the effort, the willingness to open up and try, even when it felt like the world was too complicated to make sense of. Days turned into weeks, and life in the Hale household continued to change in subtle yet significant ways. Emily and Maggie had their quiet moments together, their shared experiences of healing, and their mutual understanding that it would take time to rebuild the trust and love that had been broken. But the cracks in their walls were healing, piece by piece. Emily continued to pursue her dreams of becoming a social worker, and she found herself more passionate about it than ever before. Her experiences with her aunt, with the loneliness she had once felt, had fueled her desire to help others who struggled with feelings of isolation and abandonment. She knew that she could make a difference for someone else the way Maggie had, slowly, begun to make a difference for her. One afternoon, Emily received the long-awaited letter. She had been accepted into the university she had applied to. Her heart soared with excitement, and she immediately rushed to tell Maggie. She found her aunt in the kitchen, making dinner as usual, her focus on the task at hand. "I got in," Emily exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. "I'm going to college." Maggie paused for a moment, turning to look at her niece. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, pride, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition of how far they had come. She set down the knife she was holding and walked over to Emily, pulling her into a rare but sincere hug. "I'm so proud of you, Emily," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard for this." "Thank you for everything, Maggie," Emily whispered, holding on to her aunt a little longer than usual. "I wouldn't have gotten here without you." Maggie pulled back, looking at Emily with a small, soft smile. "You've always had it in you. I didn't know how to help you find it sooner." Emily smiled, a sense of fulfillment settling in her chest. "You're helping me now." And in that moment, Emily realized that she had come full circle. She had come to this house feeling like a burden, carrying the weight of loss and uncertainty. But now she understood that it wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fitting into some idealized version of what family should be. It was about acceptance, about trying, about showing up for each other even when it was hard. Emily and Maggie still had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, Emily felt certain that they would walk it together. They had learned that love wasn't always loud and perfect. Sometimes it was quiet and patient. But it was always there if you were willing to look for it. And that was enough for both of them. As the days leading up to Emily's departure for college grew nearer, a bittersweet sense of anticipation filled the air. The house, once a place of isolation and tension, had transformed into a space that felt like home. It was not perfect, but it was theirs, a place where Emily and Maggie had found a way to coexist, heal, and begin to rebuild the connection they had both longed for. Maggie, ever the pragmatic woman, had always kept her emotions in check. But there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor as Emily's college move-in day approached. She began spending more time with Emily, not just in the brief moments between work and study, but in real, deliberate conversations. They started talking about everything, their shared experiences, their differences, their dreams for the future. Slowly but surely, Maggie was learning how to open up, how to be the kind of aunt, and perhaps one day the kind of mother, that Emily had always hoped for. One night, as they sat in the kitchen together, preparing dinner, Maggie looked at Emily. Her brow furrowed slightly, as though she was considering something carefully. "You know," Maggie began, her voice quieter than usual, "I never really thought I'd get this close to you. I always thought I was just supposed to be the one who took care of things, the practical one. But these past few months, I've realized that I've missed out on a lot. I've missed out on knowing you. Really knowing you." Emily, who had been chopping vegetables at the counter, paused for a moment. Her heart swelled with gratitude and warmth. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "I never really understood you before. But now I think I'm starting to." Maggie smiled faintly, though there was still a sadness behind her eyes. It's hard to change, Emily. It's easier to hide behind walls and routines than to let people in. But I'm trying. And I hope, somehow, it's enough. Emily set down the knife and walked over to her aunt, standing beside her for a moment in comfortable silence. It was no longer awkward. They had found a way to share these quiet moments, and in these spaces, Emily realized they didn't need to say much. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect conversations. It was about showing up for each other in whatever way they could. I think it's more than enough, Emily said softly. You've done more than I ever expected, Maggie. You've shown me that love doesn't always look like we think it should, but that doesn't make it any less real. Maggie's eyes glistened for a brief moment, and she quickly turned back to the stove, as though the sudden surge of emotion was something she wasn't quite ready to express. Emily smiled to herself, understanding all too well. The day of Emily's departure for college arrived much too quickly. The car was packed with her belongings, clothes, books, and other essentials that somehow seemed to take up more space than they should have. Maggie had been quiet throughout the morning, handling the logistics of moving Emily in with her usual efficiency. But Emily could sense the heaviness in the air, the unsaid words hanging between them like an unspoken acknowledgement of the change that was about to occur. Are you sure you're ready? Maggie asked, her voice tight as she adjusted the bags in the trunk of the car. She had tried to sound practical, but Emily could hear the underlying emotion. Emily smiled, trying to mask the bittersweet feeling that was swelling in her chest. I think so, she said, her voice steady. I'm excited, but I'm going to miss you. Maggie turned to face her, her expression softening for a moment. I'll miss you too, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I know this is what you need. I'm proud of you, Emily. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. Maggie, always the one who kept her feelings so closely guarded, was finally letting herself be vulnerable. Emily knew how hard that was for her. It was a small but significant gesture, one that meant more than any grand declaration. All right, Emily said, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. You'll be hearing from me every week. Maggie gave her a half smile, though her eyes seemed a little misty. I expect nothing less. And, Emily, don't forget to take care of yourself. And if you need anything, don't hesitate to call. I won't forget, Emily promised, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out and gave Maggie a quick, tight hug, the kind that conveyed everything they had both been too afraid to say for so long. As they pulled away, Emily looked up at her aunt one more time. Maggie's face had softened, and for the first time, Emily felt the weight of the distance between them, not as something sad or painful, but as something earned, something they had both worked for. With one last glance, Emily got into the car, and as the engine roared to life, she glanced over at Maggie one last time. Maggie stood there, watching her leave, standing tall, just as she always had, but this time, there was a gentleness to her that Emily had never seen before. The drive to college was long, and as the city skyline came into view, Emily's heart raced with excitement and anxiety. This was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would take her far from home, both physically and emotionally. But as she sat in the car, staring out the window, she realized that she wasn't running away from her past. She was moving forward with the lessons she had learned from her time with Maggie, and the love that had quietly grown between them. When Emily finally arrived at her new dorm, the excitement was almost overwhelming. It was everything she had dreamed of: new friends, new opportunities, a fresh start. But even in the midst of it all, she found herself reflecting on her journey, on how far she had come since the day she stepped into Aunt Maggie's house, feeling lost and alone. The first few days at college were a whirlwind of introductions, orientation sessions, and late-night conversations with her new roommates. But throughout it all, Emily stayed connected with Maggie, sending her updates, sharing stories, and texting about the small victories and challenges she faced. Maggie, though still reserved, responded with her own updates, her own words of encouragement. It wasn't the constant flow of affection that Emily had once hoped for, but it was real, and it was enough. And so, life moved forward. Emily found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected. She was learning, not just about her studies, but about herself, about her own strength, her own resilience, and the quiet, steadfast love that had grown between her and Maggie. She was learning to accept her own imperfections, and to accept that love, in all its forms, didn't have to be loud or perfect to be real. And, in the quiet moments of the night, when she would pull out her phone to text Maggie, she realized that, no matter the distance, the walls they had both built were slowly crumbling. They had learned that love, in its most genuine form, was about showing up, sometimes silently, sometimes awkwardly, but always there. In that, they had found something beautiful, something worth holding on to. And Emily, as she faced her new life, knew that the bond she shared with Maggie would continue to evolve, growing stronger with every passing day. As the weeks passed in college, Emily grew accustomed to the rhythm of her new life, the excitement of her fresh start, the new friendships she was forming. And the challenges of balancing schoolwork kept her busy. But even amidst the chaos, Maggie was never far from her mind. Every evening, after her classes and activities, Emily would take a moment to text her aunt, sharing a little bit about her day, her thoughts, and the small milestones she had achieved. She had learned to appreciate the quieter forms of love that Maggie had shown her, the kind that didn't demand attention but quietly made a difference. Maggie, too, seemed to be adjusting to the change. The responses to Emily's texts were becoming longer, more personal, revealing pieces of herself that Emily had never known. For someone who had always been so composed and reserved, Maggie's messages now reflected a woman who was starting to embrace her vulnerability, one step at a time. One evening, Emily received a text from Maggie that made her stop in her tracks. "I've been thinking a lot about the past lately. About my parents. I think I'm ready to visit their graves. It's been a long time, but I feel like it's time to face that part of my life. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I guess it feels like I'm telling someone who understands now." Emily's heart swelled as she read the message. She knew how difficult it had been for Maggie to confront her past, to face the emotional wounds that had shaped her. For Maggie to reach out and share this with her was a huge step forward, a step that Emily hadn't expected, but one that made her feel proud of her aunt. "I'm proud of you," Emily typed back, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. "It's never easy to face the past, but I know you'll find peace in it. And I'm always here, no matter what." Maggie's reply came almost instantly. "Thank you, Emily. I think I'm learning how to let go of the things that have held me back for so long. I owe a lot of that to you. You've taught me more than I think you realize." Emily's heart felt light as she read the message. It wasn't just the words, but the sentiment behind them that meant so much. For so long, she had felt like the one who needed healing, the one who needed saving. But now here she was, seeing her aunt evolve, becoming a version of herself that she had never known, someone who was open, vulnerable, and ready to heal from the wounds of her past. As the year progressed, Emily continued to thrive in her new environment. She made friends who felt like family, joined student organizations that fueled her passion for social work, and found herself more and more focused on the future she was creating for herself. But despite the whirlwind of activity in her new life, she never lost sight of the bond she was building with Maggie. One weekend, during a rare break from her busy schedule, Emily decided to visit home. It had been a few months since she'd last seen her aunt, and the thought of being back in the house, now filled with new memories, was comforting. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that, whatever it was, it would be different. When Emily arrived, Maggie was waiting for her at the door. She looked different, softer, more relaxed. Her usual sharpness had dulled, replaced by a warmth that Emily hadn't seen before. It was as though the act of healing was slowly transforming her, making her more present, more accessible. "I wasn't sure when you'd get here," Maggie said with a smile, her voice light. "But I've been thinking about something." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's that? Maggie stepped aside, motioning for Emily to come in. I think it's time for us to do something together. Something we've never done before. Emily followed her into the living room, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Maggie sat down on the couch, patting the seat next to her. Emily joined her, feeling a sense of anticipation in the air. I've been thinking a lot about the future, about how much we've both changed. And I realized that we need to make some new memories. We need to do something that isn't just about the past, something that's about us, here, right now. Emily sat back, surprised but touched by Maggie's words. I agree, she said quietly. We've both been through so much, but we're still here, together. Maggie smiled, her eyes shining with an emotion that Emily hadn't seen before. Exactly. So I thought we could take a weekend trip. Just the two of us. Maybe go somewhere quiet, away from everything. What do you think? Emily felt a surge of warmth in her chest. The idea of going on a trip with Maggie, of spending time together without the weight of the past constantly hanging over them, felt like a perfect way to cement their new bond. I think that sounds amazing, she said, her voice filled with genuine excitement. A few weeks later, Emily and Maggie found themselves on a quiet weekend getaway to a small cottage in the mountains. The air was crisp, the trees vibrant with autumn colors, and the world seemed to slow down as they arrived at the cozy retreat. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt a sense of peace, the kind that came from being in the present moment, surrounded by nature and the person she had learned to love in a way she never thought possible. They spent the weekend hiking, talking, and reflecting on everything they had been through. It wasn't a trip full of grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but it was exactly what they both needed: time to breathe, to connect, and to simply be. On the last evening of their trip, as they sat by the fire, Maggie turned to Emily, her eyes filled with quiet affection. I've realized something this weekend, she said, her voice calm. That sometimes love isn't about having all the answers. It's about showing up, about being there for someone, even when you don't know what to say. And I think that's what we've done, Emily. We've shown up for each other. Emily smiled, her heart full. Yeah, we've shown up. And I'm really glad we did. Maggie reached over and squeezed Emily's hand, a small but meaningful gesture. Me too, she said softly. As the fire crackled and the stars sparkled above them, Emily realized that she was no longer the burden she had once feared she was. She had found a family in Maggie. Not in the conventional sense, but in a way that was uniquely their own, a family built on understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet power of love that was unspoken, but ever-present. For the first time, Emily felt complete. The road ahead was still long, but she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with strength, with the love of her aunt by her side, and the lessons they had learned together. They had both come a long way, but there was so much more to look forward to together. As the days after the trip passed, Emily returned to college feeling more centered, more at peace than she had been in a long time. The weekend getaway with Maggie had allowed her to fully absorb the changes in their relationship. It had given her the clarity she needed to realize that the love they shared, while unconventional and sometimes silent, was a true, solid bond. Maggie had opened up in ways Emily had never imagined. And now Emily felt like they were both on the same page for the first time in years. The walls that had once separated them seemed to be eroding, replaced by a deeper, more genuine connection. But despite the comfort that Maggie's presence brought her, Emily knew that college was still her priority, and the life she was building here was separate from the one she had left at home. She was excited about the future and what it held, but there was also a part of her that missed Maggie, even though they had made so much progress. One day, as Emily was walking across campus, her phone buzzed with a message from Maggie. She had been trying to make a habit of checking in with her aunt at least once a day, but today, Maggie's message seemed different. I've been thinking about something. I think it's time I take the next step. I'm going to start therapy. I know it's been a long time coming, but I think I'm finally ready. I just wanted you to know. Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart racing slightly. It was the last thing she had expected to hear, but in some ways, it made perfect sense. Maggie had always been so self-sufficient, but Emily knew that deep down, her aunt had been carrying the weight of so many unresolved emotions. The walls Maggie had built up over the years weren't just for protection. They were a way to shield herself from the pain of the past. Emily realized that, after everything they had been through, Maggie was finally ready to confront those emotions. It was a huge step. "I'm so proud of you," Emily typed back, her fingers shaking slightly. "You're doing something so important for yourself. And I'll be here every step of the way." It wasn't a long response, but it was enough. Maggie's reply came quickly. "Thank you, Emily. It means the world to me that you're here." Emily smiled to herself as she continued walking to class, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Her aunt was taking control of her healing, and that meant everything. It wasn't just a victory for Maggie, it was a victory for both of them. This was a moment in their journey that marked another shift in their relationship. One where they no longer just coexisted, but were actively working to grow together. As Maggie embarked on her journey of therapy, the changes in her continued to unfold in small, yet meaningful ways. Emily could tell through their conversations that her aunt was becoming more attuned to her own emotions, allowing herself to feel and express things she had kept buried for so long. She would often share the things she had learned in therapy, and Emily listened intently, offering support as her aunt navigated the difficult but necessary process of healing. One evening, about a month after Maggie had started therapy, Emily received a long text message from her aunt. "I've realized something important today. I spent so many years running away from my feelings, trying to control everything around me. But what I've learned in therapy is that it's okay to not have all the answers. I don't have to be perfect. I just need to show up for myself and for you." Emily read the message over and over, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. It was the first time Maggie had ever fully acknowledged her emotional struggles and understood that it was okay to be imperfect. It wasn't just a lesson for Maggie, it was a lesson for both of them. It was a realization that love, healing, and growth weren't linear processes. They were messy, often uncomfortable, but ultimately transformative. "You've always been enough, Maggie," Emily replied, her heart full. "And you're showing up in the best way possible. I'm so proud of you." As the academic year came to a close, Emily found herself reflecting on how far she had come since that first lonely night at Maggie's house. She had come to terms with her grief, learned to accept Maggie for who she was, and in turn, she had discovered the depth of her aunt's own heart. Their relationship had blossomed in unexpected ways, quietly, steadily, and Emily realized that they were now a family, not just by blood but by choice, bound together by the shared effort to heal and grow. Maggie's progress in therapy was ongoing, but there was a noticeable shift in the way she approached life. Emily could tell that Maggie was beginning to allow herself to experience the world in a new way, one that didn't rely on control or perfection. There was a softness to her now, a vulnerability that had always been there but was now visible to Emily. It was as though Maggie had finally accepted that being open to love and connection didn't make her weak, it made her stronger. The summer break provided Emily with an opportunity to spend more time with Maggie. She had planned to return home for a few weeks before diving into her summer internship. When she arrived, she was surprised to find that Maggie had arranged a small weekend getaway for the two of them. It wasn't anything grand, just a quiet cabin by a lake, surrounded by nature, but it was exactly what they needed. On their first evening there, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Maggie turned to Emily, her expression contemplative. "I've been thinking about all the time we've spent together recently," Maggie said, her voice steady. "And I've realized that even though we've both been through so much, we've managed to build something beautiful. We've created a new kind of family. It's not perfect, but it's ours." Emily nodded, her heart full of emotion. "I've realized the same thing," she said softly. "I didn't think I'd find my place again after everything, but you've made me feel like I belong. Like I matter." Maggie smiled, her eyes warm and genuine. "You've always mattered, Emily. You just had to see it for yourself." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sky darkened, the stars beginning to twinkle above them. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt completely at peace. The future felt wide open, full of possibility. She wasn't just moving forward in her own life, she was doing it alongside someone who understood her in a way no one else could. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but Emily knew that whatever came next, she had Maggie by her side, and that was more than enough. As the months turned into years, the bond between Emily and Maggie only grew stronger. The healing they had both undergone was ongoing, but their relationship had evolved into something stable and nurturing. They continued to support each other, learning and growing, embracing the imperfections that made their connection uniquely their own. They weren't just family, they were a team, one that had weathered the storms of the past and emerged stronger. With a love that was quiet but unwavering, together, they had found their place in each other's lives. And in the end, that was all they had ever needed. As the years passed, the changes between Emily and Maggie became more pronounced, yet they remained deeply rooted in the journey they had shared. Their relationship, once marked by distance and silence, was now a testament to the power of vulnerability and growth. Maggie, who had once held the walls of her emotions so tightly, was now more open, willing to embrace the complexities of life without the need for perfection. Emily, too, had matured in ways that reflected the lessons she had learned from her aunt about resilience, healing, and the importance of showing up, even when it was difficult. Emily had graduated from college and secured her first full-time job as a social worker. She had found a sense of purpose in helping others navigate the struggles she had once faced herself, feeling isolated, misunderstood, and lost in the chaos of life. Her passion for social work had deepened, and with each case she took on, she found herself remembering the journey she had gone through with Maggie and the emotional battles they had both fought. The work she did now felt like a reflection of her own healing, a way to pass on the lessons she had learned about empathy, compassion, and the importance of community. Maggie, in her own right, had made significant strides in her career and personal life. While she had once dedicated herself exclusively to her work as a corporate lawyer, she had slowly begun to open up to new possibilities. She took up painting as a hobby, a form of expression she had never thought she needed. The quiet hours spent with a canvas in front of her allowed her to explore emotions and thoughts she had long kept buried. It was a personal triumph for Maggie, an act of reclaiming her own identity and a quiet testament to the healing process she had begun years ago. It was during one of these quiet weekends, as Emily visited Maggie for a short break, that the subject of the future came up, something they had both avoided discussing in earlier years. As they sat in the living room, Emily sipping on a cup of tea, Maggie placed her brush down and turned toward her. "You know, Emily, I've been thinking a lot about life. The future," Maggie said, her voice thoughtful. Emily raised an eyebrow, setting her cup down. "What about it?" "I've spent so much of my life focused on building walls, trying to control everything around me, that I never really stopped to think about what I wanted next. I think it's time for me to make some changes. Not just in my career, but in my life. I've been thinking about retiring soon and perhaps pursuing something completely different, something I've always wanted to do, but never had the courage to start," Maggie said, her voice hesitant but filled with conviction. Emily leaned forward, intrigued. "Like what?" Maggie paused, looking at the floor for a moment before meeting Emily's eyes. "I've always loved teaching. I want to become a professor. I want to pass on the lessons I've learned about law and the changes that are possible. I want to teach others not just the law, but how to be compassionate, how to lead with understanding. Maybe even start a program for younger professionals who are still learning how to find their own balance between career and life." Emily sat in stunned silence, absorbing Maggie's words. She had never imagined that Maggie would consider a drastic career change, especially one that required such a leap of faith. But as the reality of Maggie's intentions sank in, Emily realized just how far Maggie had come. This wasn't just about her aunt leaving behind the corporate world. This was about Maggie stepping into her true self, the person who had always yearned to teach, to inspire, to connect with others in a meaningful way. "Maggie," Emily said. Her voice filled with admiration. "That sounds incredible. You've worked so hard for so long, but it's clear that this is something you've always wanted. I think you'll be amazing at it." Maggie smiled softly, her eyes bright. "I'm scared, of course. But I think it's time to take that step. I don't want to wait until it's too late. I want to live fully. I want to be brave enough to let go of everything I thought I had to be and become the person I always dreamed of being." Emily reached over and squeezed her aunt's hand, a gesture that had become so natural between them. "I'm so proud of you, Maggie. I've never seen you more alive than I do now." The words held a deeper meaning than Emily could express, because they weren't just about Maggie taking a career leap. It was about how far they had both come. Maggie had learned to let go of the need to control everything. She had found a way to embrace change, to embrace life, and Emily had learned that the love she had always longed for had been present all along, quiet and patient, growing stronger in the smallest moments of their shared journey. The next year, Maggie announced her retirement from her corporate job, and just as she had promised, she pursued a new path, one as a law professor at a local university. Her classes were small, but filled with young students who saw her not just as a teacher, but as a mentor who had lived through the complexities of the world and had come out the other side wiser and more compassionate. Emily continued her work as a social worker, dedicating herself to helping those who felt lost and isolated in their struggles. She had also started a community outreach program that focused on supporting young adults who had faced familial trauma, and it brought her a deep sense of fulfillment. Her work echoed the healing process she had gone through, and she found herself more and more in love with the idea of giving people the tools to rebuild their own lives, just as she and Maggie had done. They had come so far, both of them, and though there were still moments of challenge and uncertainty, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The bond they had forged was unshakable. They had both learned that the path to healing wasn't always straight. It was full of setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But through it all, they had learned to walk forward together, one step at a time. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Maggie's new home, a modest, cozy house she had moved into after retiring, Emily looked over at her aunt. They were sipping their tea in comfortable silence, the world around them calm and peaceful. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the landscape, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. "You know," Emily said, her voice reflective, "we've been through so much, and now here we are." Maggie looked at her with a soft smile. "I never thought I would get here. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad we both did." And for the first time, there was no uncertainty. No questions about what was next. There was only the knowing that, whatever the future held, they had each other, and that was all they needed. They had built something new, something beautiful, and it was theirs to hold on to. The years continued to unfold in ways that surprised both Emily and Maggie, but in the best of ways. They had both found their footing in their careers and in life. Emily's work as a social worker had become more fulfilling than she ever thought possible. She had discovered a passion for helping others rebuild their lives, drawing from her own experience of loss, healing, and growth. She had also been involved in several initiatives aimed at creating stronger community connections, particularly for those who had felt isolated or abandoned. She often found herself speaking at local events, sharing her story of overcoming grief and the journey she had taken with Maggie. Her talks resonated with many young adults who, like her, had faced difficult family dynamics or personal trauma. Emily was more than just a social worker. She was a living testament to the power of resilience, and her work was helping others heal just as she had healed. Maggie, on the other hand, was thriving in her new role as a professor. Her students adored her, not just for her knowledge of the law, but for her willingness to share her personal experiences and insights. Her lectures were filled with stories of her own struggles and triumphs, and the students often left her class feeling empowered, knowing that success wasn't just about academic achievement, it was about integrity, empathy, and the willingness to grow, both personally and professionally. Despite their busy schedules, Emily and Maggie had made it a point to maintain the connection they had worked so hard to build. Their weekend visits, dinners, and long walks in the park became rituals that allowed them to stay grounded, to remind each other that they were always there. It wasn't always about grand gestures, it was about the quiet, everyday moments they shared, moments where they could just be themselves. One summer evening, as Emily was wrapping up a particularly challenging week at work, Maggie called her. It was late, nearly 10 p.m., and Emily had just finished a project that had taken up most of her energy. She was looking forward to a quiet night in, but when she saw Maggie's name on her phone, she picked up immediately. "Hey, Maggie," Emily said, a smile creeping into her voice. "What's up?" Maggie's voice was softer than usual, tinged with something that Emily couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to talk to you about it." Emily sat up straighter, sensing that this was more than just a casual conversation. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Maggie took a deep breath before speaking again, her words slow but deliberate. "I've been feeling like there's more I could be doing, more I could be giving. It's not just about teaching law anymore. It's about leaving a legacy, about creating something that will outlast me, something that will make a difference." Emily's curiosity piqued, and she leaned forward, her heart beating faster. "What kind of legacy?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Maggie continued, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm thinking of starting a foundation, one focused on helping individuals who've faced emotional and family trauma. I want to provide scholarships, therapy, and support for people who are trying to rebuild their lives, just like we did. I want to give people the tools they need to move forward." Emily felt a rush of emotion fill her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She had always known that Maggie had the potential to change lives, but this idea, this vision, was something more. It was about creating a ripple effect, a chance for others to experience the healing they had both found, and then some. "That's an incredible idea," Emily said, her voice filled with awe. "Maggie, I think this could change so many lives. You have the experience, the resources, and the passion to make it happen. I'd love to be a part of it. I can help with the outreach, with connecting people to the support they need." Maggie's voice softened, filled with gratitude. "I was hoping you'd say that. I can't do it alone. I need your help, Emily. We've both come so far, and I want to share what we've learned with others. I think we can build something that will last." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she wiped them quickly, not wanting her aunt to hear. "I'm in," she whispered. "I'm in, Maggie. Let's do it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their decision settling in. It wasn't just about the foundation. It was about the journey they had both taken to get to this point, how far they had come, how much they had overcome. They had created something beautiful, and now they were going to share that with the world. Months later, Emily and Maggie's foundation was up and running. They called it New Beginnings, a name that symbolized the fresh start they had both fought for and ultimately found. The foundation offered scholarships to young adults who had faced emotional or family trauma, providing them with access to education, therapy, and mentorship programs. It also offered workshops and retreats focused on healing, empowerment, and building strong, healthy relationships. The first retreat they hosted was a huge success. People from all walks of life attended, all looking for a place to heal, a community to belong to, and the support they needed to start over. Emily and Maggie worked hand in hand, offering their stories, their wisdom, and their hearts. It was more than just a retreat, it was a life-changing experience for everyone involved, including themselves. At the end of the retreat, Maggie stood before the group, her voice steady but emotional as she addressed everyone. "This foundation isn't just about giving you the tools to rebuild your life. It's about showing you that you're not alone. Emily and I know what it feels like to feel lost, to feel like you have no place to turn. But you're here now. You've taken the first step. And together, we can build something that will last. We can create new beginnings for all of us." Emily stood beside her, her heart full as she watched the room of people nodding in agreement, tears in their eyes. She had seen the same look in her own reflection years ago, when she had first entered Maggie's home, unsure of what her future held. Now, here they were, helping others to see that their pasts didn't have to define them, that they, too, could begin anew. After the retreat, Emily and Maggie sat on the porch of the cabin, the soft glow of the setting sun casting a peaceful light over them. Maggie turned to Emily, her eyes filled with emotion. "You did it, Emily," Maggie said softly. "You helped me believe in this. You've helped so many people already. I'm so proud of you." Emily looked at her aunt, her heart overflowing. "We did it, Maggie. This is just the beginning. Together, we're changing lives. And I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else." They sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the breeze rustling the trees around them, knowing that they had created something truly special, not just the foundation, but the bond between them that had grown stronger with each passing year. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, they knew that no matter where the future took them, they would always have each other, forever a family, bound not just by blood, but by love, healing, and the shared desire to make the world a little brighter for those who needed it most. As the years went on, new beginnings continued to thrive, and so did the bond between Emily and Maggie. Their foundation, initially just a dream, had become a beacon of hope for so many people who had been lost in the shadows of their own traumas. Emily poured her heart into the organization, helping individuals rediscover their strength, while Maggie, now an accomplished professor, continued to mentor students who were eager to learn not only the law, but the deeper human principles of empathy and resilience. Emily and Maggie had become not just a family, they had become a team. Their shared experiences, their shared understanding, had brought them closer than either of them could have ever anticipated. What had once been a fractured relationship built on grief and silence had evolved into something deep, unwavering, and life-affirming. One day, as Emily sat in her office, reviewing the latest updates from the foundation, she received a call from Maggie. Her aunt's voice, though always composed, carried an unmistakable hint of excitement. "Emily, I have something to tell you," Maggie said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "The university asked me to lead a new program. It's a collaboration between the law school and the social work department. We're going to be working together on a project focused on restorative justice, helping students understand the intersection of law and trauma." Emily leaned forward in her chair, her heart quickening. "Maggie, that's incredible. I can't believe they're giving you this opportunity. It's exactly what you've been talking about, the connection between the law and healing." Maggie laughed, a genuine sound that filled Emily's heart. "I know, and I want you to be involved. I think it would be amazing for the foundation to have a direct hand in shaping the program. We've built something beautiful, and now we can take it even further. We can bring legal and social work practices together to create a comprehensive model of support for people who've been through trauma." Emily's excitement matched her aunt's. "I'm in, Maggie. This is what we've been working toward, merging our worlds and making an even bigger impact." The two of them spoke excitedly for hours, planning the steps they would take to make the program a reality. Emily felt like the world was opening up before them, their ideas aligning in ways that felt both natural and groundbreaking. They weren't just helping individuals heal, they were working to change systems, to create a more compassionate approach to justice, one that recognized the humanity of every person involved. Months passed, and the restorative justice program was successfully launched. It became a groundbreaking initiative, combining Maggie's legal expertise with Emily's social work experience to provide a holistic approach to justice and healing. The program offered students the opportunity to work directly with individuals who had experienced trauma, using both legal and therapeutic strategies to help them rebuild their lives. It wasn't just about fixing broken systems, it was about restoring people's dignity and offering them a chance at a new beginning. The impact of the program was immediate. Students from both fields came together to learn not just the technicalities of their respective professions, but the deeper, more compassionate skills of listening, understanding, and healing. Emily and Maggie were both proud of how far they had come. They had created a legacy, one that would continue to ripple outward, affecting countless lives for years to come. One evening, after a particularly successful meeting with the program's first group of students, Emily and Maggie sat together at the kitchen table, sipping tea. The weight of their accomplishments hung in the air, but there was no room for exhaustion, only quiet pride. "I think we've really done it," Emily said, her voice filled with emotion. "We've created something that will last. Something that will keep going long after we're gone." Maggie nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think so too, Emily. And it's all because we decided to take that first step. You were always the one to remind me that it's okay to be vulnerable, to face the things we've been running from. I never would have imagined this kind of life for myself, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Emily reached across the table and took her aunt's hand, squeezing it gently. "I wouldn't trade it either, Maggie. We've come so far. From when I first came to live with you, not knowing what the future would hold, to this. I can't believe how much we've accomplished together." Maggie smiled softly, a rare tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm proud of us, Emily. And I'm proud of you. You've become the woman I always hoped you'd be, the kind of person who not only changes the world, but makes it a better place for everyone around her. You've done more than heal your own wounds. You've helped so many others heal theirs." Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had come into Maggie's life as a grieving, lost soul, but Maggie had helped her find the strength to rebuild herself. In turn, Emily had helped Maggie find a new purpose, one that extended beyond her career to touch the lives of others. Together, they had created something beautiful, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Years later, as they sat in the same kitchen, the evening sun casting a golden glow over the room, they reflected on how far they had come. New Beginnings had grown into a national organization, its work expanding to offer support to families, individuals, and communities across the country. Maggie had retired from her teaching position, but she continued to serve as a mentor and advisor to the foundation. Emily had become a sought-after speaker and advocate, traveling the country to share her story and the lessons she had learned from her journey with Maggie. But despite their accomplishments, they never lost sight of what mattered most: the bond they shared. The quiet moments of connection, the unwavering support, the love that had grown between them. And as they looked out over the fields of their shared life, filled with the fruits of their labor and the ripples of change they had created, they knew that their journey was far from over. They had built something lasting, something that would continue to heal, to teach, and to inspire for generations to come. Because at the heart of it all was the truth they had both come to understand: love, healing, and family are not just about blood, they're about showing up, being present, and never giving up on each other, no matter what. And together, Emily and Maggie had found that love, built that legacy, and left a mark on the world that no one could ever erase. As the years unfolded, Emily and Maggie's shared legacy continued to bloom in ways they had never imagined. Their foundation, New Beginnings, not only provided scholarships, therapy, and mentorship, but also became a pillar of hope for communities nationwide. It had grown into a movement, a symbol of resilience and transformation that reached further than either of them had anticipated. What started as a dream between two women, healing from their own painful histories, had blossomed into an organization that was now touching the lives of thousands. Emily had reached new heights in her career, becoming a prominent voice in social work and trauma-informed care. She was a recognized expert in restorative justice and was often invited to speak at conferences and events, spreading the message of healing, empathy, and community-based change. Her journey had not only healed her own heart, but had propelled her into a leadership role that influenced change on a larger scale. The passion that once stemmed from her pain had transformed into a force for good. Maggie, too, had continued to inspire. Although she had retired from her academic position, she was far from slowing down. She had become a mentor and advisor to many young professors and professionals in the legal field, always encouraging them to seek compassion in their work, to see the humanity behind the cases they handled. She remained deeply involved with the foundation, offering her legal expertise to ensure that its work was sustainable and impactful. They both continued to meet regularly, as they had always done, staying grounded in their shared purpose. Though life had become busier, they carved out time for each other, whether it was over a cup of tea in the evenings, a long walk in the park, or a weekend getaway to their favorite quiet spot in the mountains. These moments were no longer rare. They were a priority. One summer afternoon, as Emily was preparing for a major fundraiser event for the foundation, she received an unexpected call from Maggie. The tone in her aunt's voice was different this time, less urgent but filled with a sense of peace. "Emily," Maggie began, her voice calm but unmistakably full of emotion. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About everything. About how far we've come and about where we are now. It feels like we've reached a place where the work is still important. But the next chapter is beginning." Emily paused, feeling the weight of her aunt's words. "What do you mean, Maggie?" There was a quiet pause on the other end of the line. "I'm not saying I'm stepping away from everything, but I think it's time for us to start thinking about the future. About how we can pass the torch. We've built something so incredible. And now it's time to empower others to carry it forward, to make sure it continues to grow even when we're not as directly involved." Emily sat back, reflecting on the depth of what her aunt was suggesting. For all they had accomplished together, Maggie's words seemed to signify a turning point, a natural progression toward the next phase in their lives. "You're right," Emily said, her voice filled with understanding. "We've always talked about creating something that would outlast us. But I never really thought about what that might look like for us, personally." Maggie chuckled softly. "I think it's about being present in a different way now. Letting go of some of the control and trusting that the work we've done will carry on, even without us constantly pushing it forward." "I agree," Emily said, feeling a quiet sense of peace wash over her. "It's not about stepping away completely. It's about creating a system where others can step in, where we can still be a part of it, but in a way that's less about us and more about the bigger picture." As the conversation continued, they began discussing what their legacy would look like going forward. Emily was inspired by Maggie's vision of letting go, not out of necessity, but as a deliberate act of empowerment. They would still be involved, still be guiding forces, but they wanted to create opportunities for younger people to step into leadership roles within the foundation. They would mentor, support, and guide, but they also needed to trust that the work would thrive without them always in the driver's seat. That evening, as Emily reflected on her conversation with Maggie, she thought about all they had achieved. She had always thought of her work in terms of the people she helped, the individuals who came through the foundation's doors looking for healing, for a fresh start. But now, as she considered the bigger picture, she realized that their work was also about creating a ripple effect. It wasn't just about offering immediate help. It was about creating systems that would empower people to heal and lead for years to come. And that, Emily realized, was the true legacy of New Beginnings. Over the next several months, the foundation underwent a period of transition, with Emily and Maggie carefully selecting new leaders to take on more responsibilities. They held training sessions, passing on their knowledge and values to the next generation of leaders. They created programs that allowed young professionals to engage with the foundation on a deeper level, ensuring that the work they had started would continue to grow and evolve. The foundation didn't just rely on one or two people, it became a community-driven organization where the work was shared, the values upheld, and the vision carried forward by a team of dedicated individuals. Through it all, Emily and Maggie remained the heart of it, guiding, supporting, and watching with pride as others took the reins. They had built something that was bigger than either of them. And as they saw the next generation step up, they knew they had accomplished more than they ever could have dreamed. They had created a movement, a place where people could come and heal, where they could feel seen and heard, and where their futures could be rewritten. One evening, as Emily and Maggie sat on the porch of Maggie's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant colors, they looked at each other with contentment. The foundation was thriving, their legacy secure, and their bond stronger than ever. "We've done it, Maggie," Emily said, her voice full of emotion. Maggie turned to her, her eyes soft and proud. "We've done more than we ever imagined. We've built a family, Emily. Not just the one we've shared, but a family that reaches out to the world, that offers healing and hope." Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "And we're still doing it. Every day. Together." Maggie nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "Together, Emily. Always." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily knew that the future was bright not just for her and Maggie, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by the work they had done. They had started with a single step, a single act of love and vulnerability. And now that love had become a legacy, one that would continue to inspire and heal for generations to come. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the evening, they both knew that the greatest gift they had given the world was not just the foundation they had built, but the family they had found in each other.